Montana Territory, late spring of 1878. The sun had barely cleared the jagged peaks when the quiet peace of Alder Creek was shattered. No. Let me go, let me go. Nella Abram's voice cracked against the pine-choked air as her boots scraped across the hard-packed earth. She fought, her fists flying, but the bandits were too many. One yanked her arms behind her back, another tied a cloth around her mouth. Her bonnet fell, tangled in bayonet grass, as they hauled her onto a horse like a sack of grain. From the edge of the barn, her father's old hound barked once, then silence. The morning wind carried no answer. The town was still asleep. They rode hard into the bitterroots, vanishing into the folds of the land. By sundown, Nella sat bound to a tree trunk in a clearing deep in the wilderness, her lips raw from the gag and her arms sore from rope. The leader, a thick-jawed man named Crane, squatted by the fire, chewing jerky. "We will send a letter," he said. "Her old man has money. Gold mine shares. He will pay." "He died 3 years ago," one of the others muttered. "She lives alone." Crane spat into the flames. "Then someone in that town will pay. Pretty girl like this, someone cares." But no one in Alder Creek saw what happened. No one except a man who never intended to speak of it. Xavier Tolan had been sleeping in the loft of the abandoned grist mill, same place he had holed up for the past month. He kept to himself, ate little, talked less. Folks in town figured he was just another drifter with too much shadow behind his eyes. They were not wrong. He had seen the girl. Watched the struggle. Could have walked away. But he had not. Now, 3 days later, he tracked the bandits through the forest, silent as snow. He moved like someone who had once worn a uniform and no longer wanted to talk about it. His rifle was old but clean. His boots, worn but quiet. He crouched in the brush above the clearing and saw her, Nella Abram, tied to a tree, her face pale beneath a crust of dust. She was watching the flames, unmoving, as if she had given up. He waited until night deepened, until the bandits took their whiskey and wandered into sleep. Then he slid down the slope, step by cautious step, until he reached the edge of the firelight. Nella stirred, eyes widening as he knelt before her. She flinched until she saw the calm in his eyes. "Shoo," he whispered. "I am getting you out." He sawed through her bonds with a knife, his fingers steady. Her breath hitched, but she nodded. They moved fast, silent through the trees, her skirts brushing the undergrowth. They did not speak until they were miles from camp, breathless beneath a canopy of fir. She leaned against a tree, her whole body shaking. "Who are you?" she asked, voice hoarse. "No one," he said, checking the trail behind them. "You do not need to know me." "I want to." He hesitated. "Xavier. Xavier Tolan. I am Nella. I live in Alder Creek." "I know." She stared at him. "Why help me?" He looked away. "Because no one else did." They made camp beneath a rock shelf. He gave her his coat, and she curled into it like a child. He stayed awake, rifle across his knees, watching the dark. They reached Alder Creek by the next evening, after crossing the river and circling wide around the bandits' trail. Townsfolk spilled into the street when they saw her, some gasping, some crying, some just staring. Sheriff Amaze pushed through the crowd. "Nella. God Almighty. We thought, where were you?" "Taken," she said, her voice steady despite the dirt on her cheeks. "They wanted ransom." The sheriff looked at Xavier. "And you are?" Xavier tipped his hat. "I was just passing through." "Not anymore," the sheriff said. "You saved her life." Nella's eyes did not leave him. "He did more than that," she said. "They brought her home, the same cabin her father built with his hands before the fever took him." She stood in the doorway, watching Xavier linger at the gate. "Wait," she said, stepping forward. You cannot just walk off now. I do not belong here. You saved my life. I did not do it for thanks. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his. Then why did you do it? He looked at her for a long moment. Because I could not stand the thought of you dying out there. She swallowed. Stay. Please. He hesitated. Just until the bandits are caught. Then we will see, she whispered. In the days that followed, whispers rippled through town. Nella was back, and the quiet man who saved her now slept in the old stable behind the saloon. Some said he was dangerous. Others said he was a hero. Nella said nothing. She just brought him food every morning and sat beside him as he ate. One morning, he said, "You do not need to keep coming." "I know," she replied. "But I want to." He looked at her, then really looked. "You are not afraid of me?" "No." "Should I be?" He shook his head. "Most people are." "Well, I am not most people." He smiled, a real smile, small and unsure. She smiled back. And something shifted. One afternoon, she found him carving a piece of wood behind the stable. She sat beside him, close enough to see the roughness of his hands. "What is it?" she asked. He handed it to her. It was a bird, wings outstretched. "For you," he said. "You looked like you needed to fly." She held it against her chest, her breath catching. "No one has ever given me something like this. I never made one before." She touched his hand. "Xavier." He looked at her, and for the first time, he did not look away. 3 nights later, the sheriff rode out with a posse and brought back 2 of the bandits. Crane was dead. The others scattered. "They will not come back," the sheriff told her. But she had already stopped looking over her shoulder. Because she was not alone anymore. That night, as the wind stirred the pines outside her window, Nella opened her door and found Xavier standing there, unsure. "I could not sleep," he said. "Then stay," she whispered. And he did. By the time the aspens turned silver with early summer wind, Xavier had taken to working with the blacksmith, a man named Delmore who'd lost most of his hearing to cannon fire in the war. Delmore didn't ask questions, and Xavier didn't offer answers. He hauled iron, stoked the forge, and kept his head down. But Nella noticed the way townsfolk watched him differently now, less suspicion, more guarded curiosity. She saw him each morning, hands blackened with soot, shirt damp from the heat of the forge. He never lingered long when she brought him bread or stew, just nodded and thanked her quiet before going back to the anvil. But she kept coming. One afternoon, she found him leaning against the edge of the corral behind Delmore's, the air thick with horses and dust. She carried a tin of cooled wild plum tart, wrapped in a cloth. "I thought you might need something sweet," she said, holding it out. He didn't take it right away. "You always bring more than I've earned. That's not how I measure things." The wind tugged at a loose strand of her hair. He looked at the tart, then at her. "You always this stubborn with people you barely know?" "I reckon I know you well enough now." He took the tin and unwrapped it slowly. "My mama used to make something like this. Only she burned the crust near every time. So it was more charcoal than tart?" "Just about." A faint trace of amusement flickered in his eyes. She leaned against the fence beside him. "You never talk about where you're from." He kept chewing. "Not much reason to." "I wasn't asking for a reason." He studied the horizon. "You ever been south of here? Toward Bannack?" "Once, when I was little. My father had business there. Claimed he was cheated blind by a man with gold dust in his teeth." Xavier nodded. "Sounds like Bannack." She glanced sideways. "You from there?" "No. But I passed through. Left a piece of myself somewhere along the Beaverhead River." never went back to find it. She didn't press. Instead, she said, I've never left Montana. Never needed to, I suppose. You've got roots here. I've got memories here. Maybe that's the same thing. They stood in silence, horses shifting in the corral behind them. Then she said, I'm fixing the fence behind my place. The rails are near rotted through. I could use help. You've got a hammer? I've got two. He set the empty tin on the fence post. I'll come by in the morning. The next day, he arrived before the sun burned off the mist. They worked side by side, replacing the rails, digging out the old posts with spades. She didn't ask why he worked so quietly, and he didn't ask why she hummed under her breath when the breeze picked up. By midday, their hands were blistered and the fence stood firm again. She brought out a pitcher of well water and 2 tin cups. They sat on the stump near the edge of the garden, sweat cooling on their backs. I used to hate this house, she said, passing him a cup. After my father died, it was too quiet. Everything he'd touched still sat in its place, like it was waiting for him to walk back in. He drank, wiping his mouth with the back of his wrist. You don't hate it now? No. Not now. He looked at her, his gaze level and steady. You're not the kind of woman to let something break you. I was. For a while. Not anymore. She met his eyes, and something unspoken passed between them, recognition, maybe. Not of the past, but of the shape of someone who understood it. Later that week, she found him in the small patch of land behind the blacksmith's, planting something in the soil. Didn't take you for a gardener, she said. Delmore gave me seed. Didn't want it going to waste. What is it? Beans, I think. Or maybe squash. The bag wasn't labeled. She crouched beside him, pressing her fingers into the earth. My mother used to say seeds don't care where they land. They just try to grow. He looked at her hands in the dirt. Is that what you're doing? Trying to grow? I think so. Are you? He hesitated. I'm trying not to run. She didn't say anything, but she reached out and brushed a smear of soil from his cheek. He closed his eyes at her touch just for a moment. That night, she left her window unlatched. Not as invitation, but as understanding. And when the wind stirred the curtains, she lay awake, certain she wasn't the only one listening to the stillness, waiting for something new to take root. The first time Xavier touched the piano in the church hall, it was raining hard enough to blur the mountains. He hadn't meant to stay that long inside, but the storm had come fast, and the door had been unlocked. The keys were warped and chipped. A few didn't sound at all. But the low notes still had weight to them, and he sat there, brushing dust from the lid with his sleeve before letting his fingers settle on the ivory. Nella found him there by accident, her hair damp at the ends, carrying a bundle of stitched linen she'd promised to drop off for Mrs. Kavanaugh. She paused at the doorway, listening. The notes came slow, uneven, like a man remembering a language he hadn't spoken in years. I didn't know you played, she said, stepping inside quietly. He didn't look up. I don't. Not anymore. You just did. He stopped. The silence afterward felt heavier than the chords. The church ladies tried to sell it last winter, she said. Nobody wanted to haul it through the snow. He ran his thumb along a broken key. It's still got songs in it. Like you, she said gently. He met her gaze, and something in his face shifted, like a door nudged open on an old hinge. That evening, she invited him to supper with Mrs. Kearns and her son Silas, who had been laid up with a broken leg since early spring. The boy was quiet, wary of strangers, but when Xavier asked about the fishing near Snowshoe Creek, Silas lit up, describing the bend where the trout ran thick in early May. Nella watched Xavier ask questions with a patience that surprised her. He didn't talk about himself, but he listened like it mattered. Later, as they walked back through the dusk, she said, "you're different than I thought, when you first came. I'm not sure what I am anymore." "You're kind." He looked down. "That's not something I've heard much." "You ought to." They stopped outside her gate. Fireflies blinked low in the grass. She turned to him slowly. "Do you want to come in?" "I shouldn't." "I didn't ask if you should." He stepped onto the porch. She opened the door. Inside, the lamplight was soft. She poured coffee, and they sat across from each other at the wooden table. The rain had eased, but the breeze through the windows carried the scent of wet leaves and smoke. "I used to think I'd always be alone," she said, fingers curled around the mug. "Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know how to let someone close again." He watched her hands, the way they stilled when she stopped speaking. "I understand that." There was a long pause. "When I was taken," she said, voice low, "I didn't think I'd come back. Not really. I kept thinking about all the things I hadn't done. All the things I'd never said." He didn't interrupt. "And then you were there. Like someone I was supposed to find but didn't know how." He set his cup down. "I didn't expect any of this. I didn't think I was capable of anything good anymore. You are." He reached across the table. His hand met hers. She didn't pull away. That night, he stayed until the oil burned low. They didn't speak much more, but when he kissed her, it was slow and certain, like a promise made without fear. The next morning, she found him in the garden, sleeves rolled, turning the soil with a rusted spade. She stood quietly for a moment, watching the rhythm of his work, the way he moved with care. "You don't have to do all this," she said. "I want to." She stepped beside him, bent to the earth, and together they planted onions and summer squash, pausing only when the sun climbed high. By the time the first green shoots broke through the dirt, he had moved into the cabin for good. No one in town questioned it. Not anymore. And in the hush of twilight, when the porch creaked beneath their chairs and the sky bruised with stars, they sat together, not needing to speak, hands entwined like roots grown deep and sure. Whatever had come before them, whatever shadow they carried, it didn't follow them through that door. By mid-July, the days hung thick with heat, and the earth along the creek beds cracked beneath the sun. Nella rose early to beat the heat, rinsing her face with cool water from the pump before pulling her hair back and stepping into the garden barefoot. The squash leaves had grown broad as a man's hand, and the beans had begun to curl upward on twine Xavier had strung between salvaged fence posts. He was already at work behind the stable, hammering a length of iron into shape for Delmore. When she arrived with a tin of cornbread wrapped in a flour sack, he set his tongs down and wiped his brow with the edge of his sleeve. "This was left over from last night," she said, offering the bundle. "But it's still good." He took it wordlessly and opened it on the workbench, his fingers tracing the browned edges. "You ever think of leaving town?" he asked, glancing up at her. "Not until lately," she replied, brushing a curl from her cheek. "Why?" He broke the cornbread in half and handed her a piece. "I've been thinking about what comes next." "You mean after the garden's grown and the fence stops sagging?" He gave a faint nod. "That, and everything else." She leaned against the doorway, chewing slowly. "I never had much reason to imagine more than this place. But now I wonder what it'd be like to see Flathead Lake, or the prairie past the Musselshell." "I've seen it," he said, setting the tin aside. "It's wide and quiet. You could ride a full day and not see another soul." "Sounds lonely." "It can be," he said. "But peaceful too. There's something about land that don't expect nothing from you." She folded her arms. "I don't want to go somewhere that don't expect anything. I want to be part of something." He looked at her then, his face unreadable. "You already are." That night, after the forge cooled and the sun dipped behind the ridge, Xavier walked the edge of town alone. He passed the livery, the dry goods store, the shuttered schoolhouse with its sagging bell tower. The moon was low and heavy, and a restless wind stirred the dust along the road. At the edge of a grove near the creek, he stopped and crouched beside a cedar stump. He pulled a folded scrap of canvas from his coat pocket and unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay a service medal dulled with age, the ribbon frayed. He stared at it a long while before burying it beneath the roots. When he returned, Nella was sitting on the porch with a basin of water, washing out linens. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "You've been gone a while," she said. "I needed to put something down." She wrung a cloth slowly. "I've been thinking too." He stepped up onto the porch. "About what?" "About a life built quiet. Not empty, just steady." He sat beside her. "You think we could make that?" She glanced at him, then looked away. "I think we already started to." A cricket sang in the distance. He reached for her hand, not to pull her close, just to hold it steady in his. "I've got nothing to offer but what I am," he said. "No land. No name worth anything. Just these hands and what they can build." She turned her palm to his, fingers threading through. "That's more than enough." The following week, Xavier began laying the foundation for a small shed beside the cabin. Not because it was needed, but because building something together felt like a kind of promise. Nella brought nails and helped him measure boards, her laughter quiet but sure when he miscounted the planks. One morning, as they stood under the eaves watching rain soak the earth, Nella said, "You could take my father's name, if you wanted. Not to be him. Just to belong here." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for her waist and pulled her close, his voice low. "I don't need a name to belong to you." She leaned into him, her voice steady. "I want you to have both." By August, the roof was finished, the garden full, and the townsfolk had stopped looking twice when she linked her arm through his at the post office or market. Children waved. Old men nodded. And when the preacher passed them on the road one afternoon, he simply tipped his hat and said, "God bless you both." And Xavier, who had once counted only days and distance, now counted the hours between her smile and sleep. They didn't speak in declarations. They didn't need to. Their life was being written in the things they built, the wind-whipped corners of shared labor, and the slow, certain weight of two people choosing to stay. By early September, the nights had turned crisp, the air edged with the scent of pine and cooling earth. The fields beyond the creek glowed golden with dry grass, and the sun dipped lower each evening, casting long, amber light over the ridgelines. Nella had begun stitching heavier curtains for the windows, humming tunelessly as she worked. The house was quieter than usual, not from distance but from ease. Xavier had taken to whittling in the evenings, shaping small animals from scrap wood, nothing ornate, just enough detail to tell a rabbit from a fox. He lined them along the windowsill without explanation. One afternoon, she found him measuring cedar boards behind the shed, a worn carpenter's square in hand. She leaned her shoulder against the frame, watching his careful alignment, the way his brow furrowed just slightly with concentration. "What's it for?" she asked. He didn't look up. "A cradle." Her breath caught. "We don't." "I know," he said gently. "But one day, maybe." She stepped closer, her voice quiet. "You thought of that?" "I think of it every morning." He ran a hand along the smooth edge of the wood. "This life we've made, it's not just for now." Nella touched the side of his arm, grounding herself in the warmth of him. "Neither am I." They spent the rest of the day working side by side. She held the boards while he hammered, and he steadied the frame as she sanded each slat smooth. The cradle took form slowly, patient and steady, just like everything else they had built together. That evening, they walked to the far edge of town where the old wagon road sloped down toward the cottonwoods. The air smelled of dust and river stone, and the sky had begun to purple with dusk. She carried a basket with bread and cheese, and he had a wool blanket slung over one shoulder. They spread the blanket near the water, where the river curved gently and the current slowed. She kicked off her shoes and dipped her toes into the shallows, the cold making her gasp and laugh under her breath. He watched her with a stillness that felt like reverence. "You ever think," she said, stepping back onto the bank, "how strange it is that after everything, we ended up here?" "I don't think it's strange at all," he said, brushing a hand across her cheek. "I think it's the first thing that ever made sense." They ate quietly, the hush around them broken only by the wind in the reeds and the low call of a nighthawk overhead. Afterward, as the stars came out, she lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath. "I used to imagine what it would be like," she said. "To love someone who saw me as I really was. And now? Now I don't have to imagine." He pulled her closer, tucking his coat around them both as the night deepened. They didn't speak again, didn't need to. The silence between them was full. The following week, Delmore handed Xavier a key and a ledger. The blacksmith's hands had begun to shake in the mornings, and his eyes had grown cloudy with age. "Time I stepped back," he said, voice low but firm. "You've earned it." Xavier opened his mouth to refuse, but Nella stepped forward and placed her hand on his back. "You don't have to keep running," she said softly. "This is yours, if you want it." He took the key. They married on the last Sunday of the month, under the cottonwoods by the river. Nella wore a dress the color of cream and dusk, with ribbon sewn into the hem from her mother's old sewing box. Xavier wore a clean white shirt and a pair of trousers Delmore had let out at the seams. Sheriff Amaze stood beside them, reading from his worn copy of Scripture, and half the town gathered on benches and blankets to witness. When they kissed, the wind lifted the leaves overhead, and a hush fell across the clearing. Not reverent, just right. Afterward, they danced in the clearing under lanterns strung from branch to branch. Silas Kearns played fiddle, and Mrs. Kavanaugh brought a tray of honey cakes that disappeared before sundown. Children ran barefoot through the tall grass, and laughter carried over the water. That night, they returned to the cabin together, hand in hand, the door closing behind them with the soft click of home. Winter came slow that year. The first snow didn't fall until mid-November, and by then the garden had been cleared, the shed roof reinforced, and the hearth stacked high with split logs. The cradle sat finished in the corner of their room, not yet used but ready. They lived quietly, but not small. Xavier ran the smithy with steady hands, his name etched in brass on the sign above the door. Nella taught reading in sums to the younger children on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the church hall. Some evenings, she read aloud while he carved. Other nights, they danced slow in the kitchen to the hum of wind against the shutters. On the first day of spring, Nella pressed his hand to her belly beneath her apron and whispered, "It's time." He nodded, his face unreadable for a long moment. Then he kissed her palm and said, "Let's begin again." Their daughter was born in late June, beneath a sky as blue as flax bloom. They named her Willa, after a story Nella's mother once told about a woman who walked across the prairie with only a lantern and her faith. She had her father's quiet eyes and her mother's steady hands. And one day, when she was old enough to ask, they told her how a stranger with a rifle and sorrow in his chest became the man who built her cradle with his own 2 hands. They never left Alder Creek. They didn't have to. In a cabin warmed by more than fire, beneath the sweep of Montana sky, they lived the kind of life most people never dared to hope for, simple, strong, and wholly theirs.